Sáenz, Bioethics Regional Advisor. I welcome you to one more webinar of the series focused on clinical trials, a collaborative effort of the Regional Bioethics Program, which is part of the Science and Knowledge for Impact of the Department of Evidence and Intelligence for Action in Health, and the Unit of Quality and Regulations of Medicines and Technologies of the Department of Access to Technologies and Medicines and Health Technologies of PAHO. I would like to start by reminding you that we will not issue a certificate for your participation, and that we will record this session for those who have not been able to attend with us today, and we will distribute the recording through our list of ethical research. We will share the link for you to register for the list, and the recording will also be available on the website of the Regional Bioethics Program of PAHO and in the Clinical Trials of the Americas portal also of PAHO. Today we will start with a presentation about the regional background for this webinar. The topic today is pre-approved protocols. We will address their importance for emergencies and overall for our region. And we will also see what challenges can come about when implementing pre-approved protocols in our region. I would appreciate the help of my colleagues in sharing my slides. As I said, I want to tell you from the Americas region where our involvement started in the area of pre-approved protocols. Many of you will remember that during the Zika outbreak that affected our region, many of us addressed the urgency of doing quick research and not produce knowledge, the need to understand how the Zika congenital syndrome was triggered. Back then, PAHO started developing standardized protocols developed in collaboration with the region. It was an important effort for all of us to be able to use the same way to develop and gather knowledge and data and have comparable data. But back then, we started as we went, and there was no time to discuss pre-approvals themselves. As soon as protocols were ready, they were approved and they were implemented. But we have had another opportunity to use pre-approved protocols in the region, and this was not being widely addressed. You may be aware of chronic kidney disease in agricultural communities in Central America. We have a couple of directing bodies documents, and to understand better the causes and manifestations of this specific type of chronic kidney disease, PAHO developed some master protocols to help researchers in the field by facilitating rigorous research in the region. These protocols were pre-approved by the Ethics Committee of PAHO. Next, please. We started discussing again pre-approved protocols in the region in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you will remember, you know that PAHO, or the region of the Americas, conducted a lot of quick research. You will remember this publication of several of us on the left in PAHO. And there were many. This is a study of the first 6 months of small clinical trials in the Americas. And this was the topic of many of our regional dialogues starting in October 2020. We saw that many times trials were small, repetitive, and had inadequate designs for the goal. So we needed a control mechanism, which was lacking. This experience led us in the region to renew the discussion about pre-approved protocols for health emergencies. If you remember, in our guidance, Catalyzing Ethical Research in Emergencies, which was published in 2022, there we had a pending regional agenda focused on the themes that were identified as urgent and priority in the region. In this guidance, we stressed the need to solve the problem that affected us as a region during COVID. We stressed the urgency of developing pre-approved protocols as part of our preparedness for future emergencies. For those of you who are not familiar with this guide, you have the QR code on the right that leads you to the guide in 4 languages of the organization and subproducts of the same publication. This is a quote of our recommendations in our pending regional agenda. Scientific community, international organizations, and health authorities need to develop generic research protocols for any possible health emergencies, as we did during the Zika outbreak. And for these protocols should standardize the main methodological aspects. So it is recommended to include an ethicist when developing protocols and sending them to a research ethics committee for its preliminary approval. In an emergency, these protocols shall be adjusted as pertinent and should be reviewed and quickly approved by that committee in its final version. Here we are referring to the ethical approval that applies to all research with human beings, but it also applies for any pertinent regulatory approvals. We will address this in this session. After this introduction, I want to introduce you
I'm going to switch to English
to Dr. Nina Resnick.
So Nina Resnick is the head of clinical development science at CEPI. CEPI is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative, and CEPI is collaborating with PAHO on numerous areas related to our ethics preparedness for future emergencies. And it's our great pleasure to have Dr. Resnick present on pre-approved protocols for clinical trials for vaccine evaluation. Go ahead, Nina. The floor is yours.
Gracias, Carla. Buenos días. Saludos desde Austria. Gracias por la oportunidad.
Good morning. I'm talking from Austria. Thanks for the opportunity to present.
So, Nina, hold on a second. We're seeing the notes for the presenter, not the full slide.
Hold on, I'll try again.
No worries.
Can you see now? I'm going in presentation mode. Hold on.
It is perfect now. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. Still fine? So thank you for the introduction, Carla. So as you know, CEPI has a vision statement, which means that we are looking at a world in which epidemics and pandemics are no longer a threat to humanity. And our mission is to accelerate the development of vaccines and other biologic countermeasures against these epidemics and pandemics. So they are accessible actually to everyone in need. And we have, and I'm not spending a lot of time on the 100 days mission, since most of you will have heard of it. I just want to briefly use and show you this slide, because I think that slide actually puts the 100 days mission in a very nice context. It was used several times already, but I think the analogy of the 100 days mission to the Formula One racing is quite strengthening. So just as Formula One race cars successfully decreased their pit stop times by 97% from about 1 minute, as you see on the left, in the 1950s to just 2 seconds nowadays, we also believe that the vaccine development process can be significantly accelerated too. So we actually need to use the same principles that brought innovation to the Formula One pit stops, and that you can call that research, development, testing, manufacturing, or regulatory. In a sense, it's the preparedness that brought the change in the Formula One, and actually that's the same thing that will bring that change for the 100 days mission. So, and Carla, you just briefly mentioned about it, but taking now COVID as an example or as a catalyst, where a vaccine was made available in record time. So you see here on the graph, if you condense and accelerate the development times even further to really come to vaccine deployment within the 100 days, so to call, you can see on the right side that millions of lives would have been actually saved. So what does it take then to actually achieve that? I mentioned preparedness, and it will need a paradigm shift. So we have to work on the preparedness side. That includes, as you see here on the left.
Nina, sorry to interrupt you a little bit, but I think you'll need to speak a little bit slower for our interpreters.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to do so. I already pre-warned the interpreters that I'm speaking quite fast. Okay. So on this slide here, what you see on the left is actually the preparedness side. So that includes preparing a scientific toolkit and including the pre-approved protocols, for instance. That includes develop infrastructure as well as policy. Then that will enable us to actually break the firewall between the development and intervention. And all of that together then will enable us to respond in case of an outbreak quicker. We can then actually start building on established scenarios and can adapt and create and test the pathogen-specific vaccines much quicker. And during then the second 100 days, we then can release the vaccine or deploy the vaccine. And during that time, we can again then expand clinical evidence in a sense of clinical trials or real-world evidence. And also here, pre-approved protocols come into play. When you now let's focus now on the pre-approved protocols per se. So, which are, as I said, one essential element of preparedness. So pre-approved clinical trial protocols are scenario-specific study designs for clinical trials that have been vetted by regulatory agencies and ethical bodies. Due to their pre-approval status, these protocols can be rapidly implemented when a new vaccine candidate emerges or during new emerging outbreaks. So by having these protocols actually pre-approved, it allows a quicker initiation of trials, ensuring that vaccine can actually reach then the public faster in times of an urgent need. So what are actual key components of these pre-approved protocols? I already mentioned it earlier. So it will be scenario-specific endpoints that are tailored to trials and to specific pathogens, enhancing then their applicability. We would need predefined statistical analysis plans, which are embedded in the protocol to actually provide clarity and consistency for evaluation of the results. We need harmonized safety monitoring procedures that are crucial for protecting participant health, and build upon prior knowledge that was gathered during routine vaccine development for and identification of safety signals, for instance. We also finally need pre-negotiated, which is very important, also pre-negotiated trial infrastructure where we can then feed in these pre-approved protocols. And we need the capacity in place that allows for a swift initiation of those clinical trials during outbreaks. So, as you know, CEPI is working on several priority pathogens, some of which are actually depicted here on the slide, like Lassa, Nipah, or Sudan virus, but most importantly for the region that we are that affects the PAHO region is chikungunya. So let's take now chikungunya as an example. This erythrogenic mosquito-transmitted virus can actually occur everywhere where the mosquito occurs. It could be an outbreak like the one Paraguay actually experienced last year with several thousands of cases and an unusual pattern of disease. Or it could be a small outbreak like the one in Italy, in the Emilia-Romagna region in, I think, 2007, with around roughly 300 autochthonous cases. Or we could experience a huge outbreak in the Indian Ocean with millions of people infected, like where we just saw a peak of that in La Réunion and Mauritius. So each individual outbreak would require different clinical trial outbreak response strategies, would require different clinical trial designs, would require different operational readiness on the ground, and involve many of different stakeholders. So what I want to show you and what I want to exemplify with this slide is that it will take multi-level approaches, and it is not a single strategy that fits all. It's not a single strategy that fits for an individual virus. It needs multiple layers. So with the different diseases in mind, let me expand on this further, and let's focus on what needs to be taken into consideration in terms of clinical trial design for a specific scenario, that is to generate critical evidence for either pre or post-approval requirements for vaccines. Different pathogens, as well as outbreaks, require different or have different characteristics. So we need to take into account the vaccine platform specific characteristics, such as, for instance, is the vaccine in an early versus late stage development? Is platform data available? What is the benefit to risk ratio? What is the regulatory status of that vaccine? And when you're considering outbreak specific characteristics, is it a local outbreak? Is it regional or multinational outbreak? Are you facing an epidemic or pandemic? Is it self-limited, short-lived, or multi-year outbreak? All of that needs to be taken into consideration, as well as pathogen-specific considerations on the transmission route, on the virulence, case fatality rate, are not a strain change, and so forth. And also, of course, are there other public health containment measurements that could influence the curve of the outbreak? All of that needs to be taken into account, and all of that would require different clinical strategies and would require a different scenario. So what is important to discuss and what is important to consider for pre-approved protocols is really early on engage with the stakeholders. And these include the regulators, regional entities, key opinion leaders in the region, the investigators, of course, as well as the vaccine developers, and last but not least, also the communities. And these need to be engaged very early on and from the start to ensure that we have a comprehensive input from everyone and alignment on the study design and its acceptability to everyone. Protocols should have built in a flexibility for different vaccine candidates to adapt to varying needs, ideally being actually vaccine agnostic. You need to plan for adaptive modifications based on emerging epidemiological data to stay responsive to new information and improve outcomes. As well as we need to include some agility in the study design to adapt based on, for instance, different incidents or different findings where we see that incidence in high-risk populations is different or they're differently affected. So all of that needs to be taken into consideration. So coming to an end, I just want to briefly mention what CEPI is currently working on and provide you a little overview of our ongoing projects and initiatives that we are focusing at the moment on for improving outbreak preparedness and clinical trial designs. So as you know, we are a global organization and we take the C in our name, the C that stands for coalition. So we take that very seriously and we foster global collaboration among scientists, among organizations and governments to tackle the infectious diseases. And some of our projects that we are currently working on, for instance, is the PRESTO project that stands for Prepare Using Simulated Trial Optimization, where we're trying to accelerate the estimation of vaccine efficacy and real-world evidence studies by simulating vaccine trial and study designs based on the current epidemiology. And we're trying to do that for all of our CEPI priority pathogens. We're also looking at innovative clinical trials. So CEPI is developing innovative approaches to clinical trial designs to accelerate vaccine development and approval. We're also looking, for instance, we have kicked off a pre-approved protocol, a rapid response protocol for potential Nipah X outbreak in the Asian region and a MERS outbreak in the peninsula of Saudi Arabia, for instance. And these protocols are supposed to include plug-and-play elements. We are also looking at artificial intelligence-generated protocols to increase the efficiency. And last but not least, with all of these, we actually want to build a library of ready-to-go pre-approved protocols and incorporating pre-aligned scenario-specific evidence generation strategies for a rapid initiation of these time-sensitive clinical trials. So we want to have a library where we then, in case of an outbreak, just simply push a button and out comes a pre-approved protocol that is ready to go with no need for negotiation or lengthy discussions on optimal trial design. And last but not least, I want to highlight the close collaboration that we are having with our PAHO colleagues. So with that, I thank you. And again, thanks for the opportunity to present.
Thank you so much, Nina. This was extremely enlightening, and we're very happy at PAHO to be collaborating with CEPI. So now we're gonna invite our colleague, Sara Carracedo. Creo que todos conocen a Sara Carracedo, es también bioeticista del programa regional.
I think you all know Sara Carracedo, ethicist at PAHO. I want to welcome Sara. She will address ethical aspect, but before going on, I want to remind you to please use the Q&A function to ask questions that our panelists may respond to later. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Sara.
Carla, por la presentación. Es un gusto estar aquí. Thank you for the introduction, Carla. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I trust that everyone is seeing my slides in presentation mode. All right, then. Today, we are going to look at the ethical challenges, or rather the research ethics perspective on pre-approved protocols for clinical trials. To start with, I think it is important to clarify these concepts. And when we talk about ethics pre-approval, we're not referring to the typical ethics approval that we know, but rather a preliminary one, a very initial one. But that is a big deal. Nina and Carla talked about generic protocols. And when we talk about a generic protocol, that's like a framework research protocol that will establish the objectives, methods, and research procedures in general terms. On the right, you can see a figure in which the generic protocol would be like the skeleton of the research. And that generic protocol will then get filled in with specifications in order to conduct a study in a specific place with a specific population, having informed consent documents that are adapted to the context. And so then you move from the skeleton to the contextualized protocol, which is an individualized protocol, the final protocol, and there we see a fleshed out human being with all the organs and everything that is needed. So the difference between the generic protocol, or rather moving from a generic protocol to a contextualized protocol, is key in order to understand what we are referring to with ethics pre-approval and the final ethics approval. Ethics pre-approval is the preliminary review and approval of the generic protocol, the skeleton that we see. This generic protocol that's been pre-approved does not mean that it's a study project that can begin implementation right away. Rather, it's an initial approval that does not suffice and later will have to be reviewed and given final approval once the generic protocol becomes a contextualized protocol. So pre-approval is not the green light to start the research, but rather pre-approval of the skeleton on general key aspects of the protocol, which later will be filled in with all of these specific specifications. So we just wanted to be sure that you're clear on what an ethics pre-approval is. And then ultimately, the difference between that and a final approved ethics protocol. That's key to understanding this ethics review process. And how does the ethics review process go? First, a request is submitted, the generic protocol is submitted to the ethics committee so that it can review it and give it preliminary approval. When the committee gives pre-approval, they might require certain elements or considerations to be borne in mind for the contextualized or final protocol, which will also be coming back before the ethics committee to get the final ethics approval. The generic approval always comes back to the ethics committee to give it the final approval before the research can begin. When the generic protocol gets pre-approval, and then when we get the new contextualized protocol, that's contextualized during an emergency, has to be sent to the committee to be reviewed and given final approval, as is true with any research on human subjects. However, this process has to be more expedited. So the final approval should be quicker because I've already pre-approved some of the elements and I'm aware of the generic protocol. I know what it's aimed at. And with an expedited review, we can have a quicker ethics approval process. But what is clear is that pre-approval does not mean that the research can start the next day. Pre-approval of a generic protocol means that the protocol has to come back before the committee to see whether it gives the final approval. And the process for final approval will be shorter, quicker, more expedited. Here we have a timeline, and we see it under non-emergency and emergency conditions. The idea is that when it's not an emergency, you should develop the generic protocol. request the ethics pre-approval from the ethics committee, and the ethics committee should give the pre-approval. Then when an emergency occurs, this generic protocol gets contextualized. It comes before the committee once again, and if the committee agrees, well, it should include the contextualized one should address the comments that the ethics review committee issued at the pre-approval stage, and then there is a request for approval, an expedited review, and then if everything is ethically acceptable, then it gets ethics approval, and then the study can begin. And of course, the ethics committee also has the task of monitoring implementation of the investigation. So this is the overview of the process, but it is also important to mention some of the challenges that may arise and do in fact arise with this issue of ethics pre-approval. The first thing I think is important to mention is how specific the generic protocol should be. How detailed should a generic protocol be? If we think again about the image of the skeleton, what are the bones or parts that need to be present for the preliminary review? We know you need to have a head, a spinal column, extremities, but even though it's apparent that in some cases it's going to be very apparent that a generic protocol is insufficient. It's too vague, it doesn't tell us enough information, and it doesn't go into the details of the methodological design or the other elements that we heard in the first two presentations. It might be a draft, but it isn't. That might be a draft generic protocol, but in other cases it will be very clear when the generic protocol will have a very detailed methodological structure, and the inclusion and exclusion criteria, although broad and generic, will allow some flexibility for the contextualized protocol. So that is a generic protocol that works well. So we have to be aware that some protocols will be in a gray area, and the ethics committee will have to ponder whether it is truly a generic protocol, even though it doesn't have all of the contextual specifications. It gives us a detailed enough description of the study design, which later can be adapted to this specific research project. Or whether, on the contrary, what we are facing is too vague of a protocol that requires more work. In addition, I think it is also important to mention that this determination about which bones need to be part of that skeleton of a generic protocol, it is not always so easy, because to large degree it will depend on the type of study or clinical trial and risks, and whether it's a protocol to develop a very innovative health technology, or whether it's areas that haven't been well studied. So it might seem that there is no single formula that will apply to all cases. And in the ethics committee, we need to understand when we're facing a generic protocol, and we can go through the 1, 2, 3 checklist, and that's a generic protocol or not. This means that we, as members of ethics committees, need to be aware of generic protocols and learn as we go. So this brings me to the second challenge. How do we adjust the committee's review process? In our procedures, we have to include this pre-approval mechanism. So if we're looking at these protocols, then in principle, we need to have the possibility that the protocols submitted to our committee can be reviewed. I believe that we should put together these operations and procedures. We need to, as we said at the beginning, we need to be clear on the difference between pre-approval and final approval and understand how this review will include both pre-approval and final ethics approval. And also, we need to bear in mind what a pre-approval is not. I think that in practice, we can improve these review procedures. But I also wish to highlight that we need to bear in mind that during COVID, committees worked very hard and learned a lot. And this effort required them to do rapid, rigorous reviews during the pandemic, but this might be easier if we have pre-approvals in place. This will not only expedite the organization of research that is needed during emergencies, but also will allow the committees to be better prepared and organized to oversee the research that is going to help us catalyze research during health emergencies. In closing, I would also like to point out that none of this is really written down. There is no predefined formula. We have all of the actors involved in research should be thinking about this and find solutions that are appropriate to the context of the region in order to be able to implement these pre-approval generic protocols. And this means we have to work in collaboration with researchers, regulatory authorities, and learn together as we go. At the end of the day, this is imperative in order for us to be better prepared for future emergencies as we make sure that studies are conducted ethically. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Carla says, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for reminding us of this huge learning process we have gone through in the region of the Americas during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we understand that this will help us move forward with more decisive procedures to prepare ourselves for any future emergency. I now have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Patricia Saidon, who is going to speak to you from the perspective of regulatory agencies. And we can share an infographic in the chat. There is some overlap of the ethics and regulatory approvals. And in this regard, for clinical trials, such as what Nina was describing to us, we also have to have regulatory approval. And to this end, we can also think of successfully using a pre-approval process. Dr. Patricia Saidon has extensive experience in the international sphere at UNMAT for several years, and we are now very pleased to have her as part of the Quality and Regulation of Medicines and Health Technologies at PAHO, because she is an expert on clinical trials. You have the floor, Patricia. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm going to share screen.
Y lo que me voy a referir a mi
I'm
visión
going to
los desafíos
speak about
de este tema
the
fundamental
pending challenges
de
and the
protocolos
importance
preaprobados.
of pre-approved
Teniendo en
protocols.
cuenta que
We also should bear in mind
toda la
that
sociedad,
for all of
particular, me
society,
voy a
and in
referir yo
particular
para
for
las
what
agencias
I'm going to
regulatorias,
speak about for the
es
regulatory
imperioso durante la
authorities,
pandemia
it was
acelerar el
imperative
acceso a
during the
datos,
pandemic
ensayos
to
clínicos,
accelerate access to
para poder tomar
data on
diferentes
clinical trials.
decisiones regulatorias rápidas que sean
That's
a su vez
crucial for
efectivas, garantizar
making quick
que
and
esas
effective decisions.
esos procesos rápidos
So we also need to make sure that these expedited processes are of high enough quality that we can make regulatory decisions that are the right ones. In this regard, the pre-approved protocols may be one of the measures that we can use to have a quicker access to the data. I remind you that there are countless processes that must be taken by the regulatory authorities during a pandemic. Some of these have to do with how you approve a given product. For example, we have the emergency use evaluation and the accelerated approval. And one example of this might be the emergency use authorization that the FDA and the WHO authorities granted for vaccines during the pandemic. And this helped make effective, safe vaccines available. So a vaccine was developed, as Janina was, and then Nina already mentioned this during normal times. And when we accelerate this process, you can make vaccines available to society in general. This would have been much faster if we had already had pre-approved protocols. So this is one of the lessons that we learned from the pandemic. In 2020, a survey was conducted in the region on regulatory mechanisms for vaccine approval that were followed by national regulatory authorities in 21 countries of the region of the Americas. As you can see, at that time, they used reliance on different regulatory authorities, and some 71% did this for emergency use. Others used the procedures under normal conditions, and others used other mechanisms. But after this experience, many countries incorporated into their regulations processes that would enable them to conduct emergency assessments and allow products to go online more quickly. The regulatory authority must always bear in mind that these products need to meet the same standards of quality, safety, and effectiveness as under normal conditions. Another thing that we learned during the pandemic was how to conduct multi-center studies that provide efficiencies and levels of representation for the region and enable you to surmount the logistics and regulatory hurdles. And so really it was a matter of solidarity, the Solidarity Plus trial. And this was applied in the region, and there were adaptive studies. There were also oncological studies. People weren't very familiar with this, but in many cases, the adaptive designs within these multi-center studies, and this obliged the regulatory authorities to prepare themselves to be able to read these designs and understand them. And the statistical parameters are not similar to what they are accustomed to in conventional randomized clinical trials that we are more used to. So there was a big learning curve that allowed us to improve the efficiency of the national regulatory authorities during the pandemic. These adaptive studies stayed there after the pandemic because we learned the advantages of trials designed this way for certain diseases. Reliance and harmonization. As we said, we did use reliance, but not as much as it could have been. I always say that we need to learn to use these mechanisms more and have greater collaboration amongst our regulatory authorities so that we can accept the data of agencies doing health surveillance, and also in terms of evaluation, inspection, and analysis of results. And we also had several initiatives for harmonization of common guidelines in order to make harmonized decisions. And finally, we began to use real-world data. As we know, protocols have very strict selection criteria and do not fully represent everyone who will use them afterwards. So in this regard, we began to use this real-world data essentially as regards safety aspects, but later was extended to other areas, and many regulations put out guidelines in terms of using real-world data to complement the evidence in clinical trials. So we now have some important instruments to accelerate these processes. However, we saw that it would have all been even faster if we had had pre-approved protocols that would have allowed us to use all of those mechanisms. We would have used them all, but more quickly. These pre-approved protocols will have the advantage of cutting the time between identification of the threat and start of the trial or research, which can be a long time. And the other advantage will be to standardize concepts and results amongst the countries of the region. And finally, to have greater international coordination. Several centers under a same regulatory and ethics framework. But this does bring in some challenges, which I will describe. First of all, we cannot expect to have a regulatory framework to implement the pre-approved protocols until we see the threat. And the threat there, we have to think about the regulatory framework. So I'm very pleased to see that we have forums for discussion such as this one to begin to think about a topic that we don't usually think of, something that not much has been written about. But in our region, we need to think about this to see what is the regulatory framework, or rather, what are the various possibilities of a regulatory framework that would allow the regulatory authority to have pre-approved protocols to be used in case of a pandemic. In this regard, then in terms of implementation, I have a proposal, but I know that Laura from ANMAT is going to expound upon this. But I just wanted to mention a couple of other things in preliminary fashion. The other issue is that the pre-approved protocols must also be monitored. We need some follow-up. I might pre-approve this, but I must continuously be aware of what is happening so that all the sponsors of said protocol can update the information as the situation evolves and the scientific and regulatory knowledge evolves. And as I said, we have to prepare. We have to think of what the regulatory structure will be overall, what the rule will be, what sector or sectors of the regulatory agency will be involved, and what procedures, if you have to have forms for submitting the information, or whether you need to have something else that we're going to look at in a moment. And also the key factors for implementation of pre-approved protocols is that there be continuous updating, and the protocol needs to be adapted to the local situation, adapted to the context of the region and each specific country. And we also need to have the institutional capacity with a regulatory framework, with procedures, and with a structure that has been designated for looking at these protocols. So in terms of implementation, I understand that the regulatory authorities can evaluate and approve generic protocols before an emergency occurs. So these are protocols that obviously need to comply with best clinical practices, need to be aligned with the national regulations on the submission of protocols, but they also require a special regulatory framework, which we need to think of in terms of guidelines or standard or an instrument that the regulatory agency might have, so that it's useful when it's needed. Continuing with implementation, I believe that one option is, this isn't for this specific purpose, but this can be used, and I know that Laura is going to talk about that a little bit later. But I think that the sponsor should have a chance to request a meeting, not a conventional meeting, but rather a regulated meeting that would discuss the entire plan regarding the pandemic, to discuss what is the skeleton and the main conditions of this pre-approved protocol, that would discuss what logistical issues have been considered for the pre-approved protocol, and then this would be pre-approved within a standard, and then during the emergency, once it's declared, then we might have a simplified reporting instead of the entire process. That might be a possibility. Of course, as long as that protocol addresses all the general issues of the pandemic, and you have to identify what address any loose threads that were there, and this is if we should have a letter of adaptation and specific adaptations as necessary. The next thing is what UNMAT already has, using the figure of prior presentation, discussion, and consensus. And then the need for you, the regulators here, and really everyone in society, should think of the need to discuss potential regulatory frameworks, but there has to be a regulatory framework which will lead to accelerated activation. All right, so that is what I wanted to tell you today, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you for sharing with us the experience that we already have in the regulatory realm in the region. So this is what we can build on to improve, to keep moving forward. And I think that we are in an excellent position to draw a distinction and take action so that in a future pandemic or emergency, we are ready to take actions. I see we have many questions that keep coming in through the Q&A box. And now I would like to invite Dr. Hans Vasquez,
iba a decir desde su perspectiva de
who is going to
investigador, pero
speak from the perspective of a researcher. But he really has multiple perspectives, and he is going to share with us his thoughts on this subject. We thought that it was important to invite someone to speak from the perspective of the investigator, and someone from the perspective of an ethics committee, and someone else from the regulatory perspective. In previous webinars, as we've said, he's a researcher, but he also has a history of working on the governance of research. And he was previously the head of the Institute of Health of his country, Peru. Thank you very much for being with us today, Hans. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Carla. Muchas gracias a la Organización Mundial de la Salud por la
Thank you very much, Carla, and thank
invitación.
you very much to WHO for the invitation. I was listening carefully the last presentations.
Recordaba que me tocaba inicialmente.
I didn't remember that now was my turn. Well, anyway,
Seré más o menos breve, ¿no? Yo
I
trabajo
will
en un
be brief.
consorcio
I
de
work
instituciones
in a consortium of
desde ya algunos
institutions
años que realizan
already for some years,
investigación,
institutions that do research
principalmente en enfermedades infecciosas, ¿no?
mainly
Coordinados por el NIH.
in infectious diseases,
Me ha
sponsored
parecido
by
muy
my
importante
national
lo último que
institute.
decía también Patricia Saidó
The
y
last
Carla, de
thing
que estos
that Carla and
procesos de
Patricia
preaprobación no
Saigon
son
said,
nuevos, digamos, en
that
el
these
ámbito
pre-approval
regulador, no
processes
solo
are not
regional,
new.
sino
This
mundial,
is very
existen
important. This
en el
at-
ámbito de la autorización de
this
medicamentos,
exists already in the world in authorization of medicines and conditional authorizations, especially during pandemic. Even though we don't have much or any experience in regards to clinical trials, we are all looking for more efficient and agile processes. And this is one of the WHO action plans to consolidate countries' recommendations to establish a more adequate clinical trial system responsive to countries' needs. This is not new, and this presents a very important opportunity. That is to say that it's important that we are talking today about pre-approved protocols, especially for public health needs, for emergencies, and for any situation for which we are not prepared. From the perspective of researchers and needing incentives and funds, I would like to start by addressing the need for this process of pre-approved protocols. The process needs to be efficient, but from the point of view of the researcher, this is key because we need predictability and transparency. So an efficient process to authorize on a preliminary basis a protocol makes it possible to have an incentive to receive funds to prepare, as Nina said, the research centers. It's not only an initial authorization, it's a matter of being ready to address different aspects from the research team and the research center, and also covering lab aspects, pharmacies, community involvement, staff, administrative topics, policies, different administrative topics for which we need to be efficient. Research centers that oftentimes don't have resources, but they need such resources and incentives, so they need to be prepared. And these pre-approval systems and the standardization of minimal aspects makes it possible to be more efficient when it comes to using resources and to implement quickly this research. This is not done overnight. So we need to prepare research teams, research centers. We need to standardize administrative and operational themes. All of this is of great significance. This aspect, it's a stimulus and incentive. And from the researcher's perspective, this is essential. As Carla said initially, and I also said this is not new, there have been not only experiences of medicines of authorizations as we gathered experience in the pandemic. And I go back to the stimuli and incentives topic. We could generate funds to implement or develop this type of protocols with seed funds for ethical and regulatory review that are predictable and can be quickly implemented. So I think it is fundamental, this as a strategy, to implement quickly and use resources efficiently. This, when it comes to pre-approved protocols, this is very important. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hans, for your presentation. It's a pleasure now to welcome Dr. Sergio Surugi Siqueira, who is with us from Brazil. He will share the ethics committee perspective. He's an external member of the PAHO ethics committee, but he also has a very significant experience, which is very important for this discussion. He was a member of CONEP during the health emergency, so his experience in reviewing protocols over 48 hours will be very important in his contribution today. Go ahead, Carlos. Good morning. Thank you very much, Carla, for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be again here with you. The role in this panel is my role would be something like the devil's advocate. Of course, we all agree on the advantages of pre-approval. There's no doubt about that. The pre-approval is extremely important, especially during health emergencies. But there are also challenges, and we need to address these challenges from the ethics committee point of view. I will address a few important points to be able to discuss this later, but I also will propose some solutions so that these challenges are not unsurmountable when working with pre-approved protocols. The first thing we need to say is that there's a significant difference between an approval and evaluation process between the health regulatory entities and ethical approval. Why do I say this? Because the criteria for health approval are quite objective in general. Unlike the ethical approval, that sometimes we are not so objective. There are different regional aspects, and within the same region, there are maybe differences between different sites with more or less experience in clinical protocol evaluation, and this can change our operations. This is a challenge. How can we reduce this problem? We need clear rules, but not all regions have clear rules or clear formal rules. And also, even countries that have clear rules have another problem, that rules are clear but not flexible. And this makes it difficult to approve a project that has something that differs a bit from these unflexible rules. This is a first issue. Second, there's a difference between the technical capabilities of ethics committees, and this can lead to unsafety or insecurity when assessing a project. As Dr. Sara said, with a skeleton, that can lead to insecurity and to lead that the approval of a generic or master project do not have the advantage of being covering a shorter time period, because there may be some interruptions and we don't have any advantages when it comes to shorter approval times. All research protocols have a key element, which is informed consent for master studies and adaptive studies that sometimes can bring great difficulties in an ethical approval. If a person is not well familiar with this situation, this can lead to insecurity and take a long time to assess and approve a protocol. Normally, these master protocols, not always, but often, it would be the ideal. This happened during the pandemic. These protocols are developed by multilateral agencies. We know that for political reasons, oftentimes there's a certain rejection or refusal from some regions or countries when it comes to embracing multilateral agencies. This could also generate a rejection or some prejudice that can also make it difficult to assess pre-approved protocols. Well, maybe you could say, what happens with Sergio? He appears to be quite pessimistic. Well, no, this could be certainly solved with previous conversations, especially with multilateral agencies. There's the challenge to approach the ethical agencies of each region, each country, through an MOU, for example, or an intention, a prior protocol of intentions with some rules, procedures, intentions, so that when there is an opportunity or the need to work with generic or pre-approved protocols, that could be pre-agreed. This is an initiative. Well, someone mentioned this, I think it was Dr. Saidon, who said something similar. This would be a need to approach and have a good dialogue with entities, especially when there are national entities for ethical approval or ethical assessment, to have a previous conversation with those agencies to pre-agree some criteria or the procedures in these cases. A document issued by a multilateral agency would be very welcome, but it would not be enough to have this conversation if that agreement or memorandum is not addressed before any operation. This is what I wanted to say from the point of view of ethics committees. Then we can delve into more details with more specifications. But I stop here for now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sergio. And now have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Laura Traversi, who is with us from the Argentine regulatory agency called ANMAT. She's head of the clinical test department and medicines management of ANMAT. She will share her experience from the point of view of a regulatory agency. Laura, you have the floor. Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this forum. When it comes to this topic, we at ANMAT will share the regulatory tool that can be applied to this type of situations. And we use this tool during the pandemic, and we continue using it today for situations where that pose a challenge, a study, a protocol, a project that entails a challenge when it comes to evaluation, implementation, and monitoring. This regulatory tool, which is a standard or a regulation, makes it possible to have a meeting prior to the formal presentation of a protocol. That previous meeting conducts a pre-assessment with exchange of opinions about a specific study. The process starts when there's an institutional mail requesting a meeting that is published in the regulations and the ANMAT website, and you need to send the documentation for this protocol, and the requester, the applicant, needs to clarify what is the reason to request the meeting, and they need to fill out a form containing basically the general information of the protocol, and if there were a research product, any additional information about the research centers, participating countries, all the data required in the form for us to study this application. When we receive this regulatory email, we meet in the team as assessors. We analyze the information sent by the applicant, and we coordinate a meeting. We schedule a meeting, and with this, once conducting the analysis, we have the meeting with exchange between different experts. We can call a researcher about an orphan or infrequent pathology, or a pathology that requires some expert details. And we at ANMAT, we can also call upon other areas or internal in-house experts that could collaborate in this exchange. The meeting normally lasts 1 hour on 1 hour and a half, and we address the project, establishing any local requirements for the formal presentation after the protocol. At the end of the meeting, we at ANMAT draft minutes. The meeting now is virtual. Before the pandemic, the meetings were in person, but now we only have virtual meetings. And at the end, we draw minutes where we summarize the exchange and the requirements and criteria. This is used when the study is formally presented, and then we have an assessment file that has to be attached to the assessment of these studies by indicating that there has been any pending information, and then we require that pending information. All that has been agreed to at the meeting. During the pandemic, in addition to conducting this type of meetings, we modified our evaluation processes. Normally, we do a sequential evaluation between different areas or sectors inside ANMAT. During the pandemic, we conducted simultaneous evaluations, coordinating different in-house areas in ANMAT. We also had comments, and if in the event of any comments, we address them jointly. If there are any comments or observations or remarks, we address this to be able to have a simultaneous response. Among the benefits of this process of preliminary meeting and pre-evaluation is a greater efficiency, shorter evaluation times, and this also opens up from the beginning a dialogue channel that makes it possible to exchange ideas, elements from the beginning, already before the formal presentation of the study, and we can also address any potential risks. Having addressed this at the meeting, for example, what is the pathology under study, which is the studied population, or for example, if there's any innovative medicine, what will be the circuit, and the dissemination, which can be difficult in our country. All of this can be addressed at the meeting. We can have already addressed this and pre-approved when it be right before the formal approval and presentation of the study. In this sense, the pandemic was very useful. It posed a challenge that called for more effort in the usual studies that we have to assess. This entails a greater effort and the need for a proactive and constant communication. But all of this was very useful in the pandemic. And this is an experience that can be applicable to other situations as epidemics or endemic situations and pandemics. Thank you very much. That's all. Thank you very much, Laura, for sharing your experience and making us see that we need to build on what we have. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to invite Nina, Sara, and Patricia to join the meeting. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Hans and Sergio, for your contribution. So now I want to start by stressing a couple of things before going to the discussion with Nina, Sara, and Patricia on the topic. One of the points I want to discuss with them. One of the points I want to discuss has to do with the context in which pre-approved protocols are valuable. It is very clear that they are essential during emergencies, but I don't think that their value is limited to emergencies only. But Nina, please explain to us specifically the value, the benefit of pre-approved protocols during outbreaks or emergencies. Nina, go ahead.
Thank you, Carla. I think I mentioned in my presentation already the benefit of having pre-approved protocols ready, since when you are being prepared up front, everything that you do up front, everything that you do in preparation of a pandemic gets you ahead of the curve of an outbreak. So, and in a timely, sensitive manner during a pandemic or an outbreak, it's essential that you have like even pre-approved protocols already pre-discussed, pre-negotiated, and in place with the regulatory agencies, with the bioethical bodies to actually start a clinical trial as soon as possible. I understand that there will be some modifications necessary once you actually are aware of what the epidemiological characteristics of an epidemic are. And I think I mentioned in my presentation some kind of the transmission routes, the fatality rates, or what kind of populations are affected. But I think the purpose of a pre-approved protocol actually is to take as much as in consideration as you can upfront, to then have to tweak as little as possible afterwards. So to really speed up then also the final approval. And I think you called it a generic versus a conceptualized protocol, whether it's a protocol and then a protocol amendment, to really speed up the initiation of the clinical trial as much as possible. So I think for a pandemic preparedness perspective, I think having pre-approved protocols, it's essential to get ahead of the curve.
Muchas gracias, Nina. Antes de darle la palabra a Sara
Thank you very much, Nina. Before giving the floor to Sara and Patricia, I want to stress that we at PAHO and also at WHO use many times pre-approved protocols for situations that are not emergencies as part of our support to the countries. And as part of that support, we develop protocol to help researchers and help also the jurisdictions where some research has to be conducted, so that these jurisdictions and researchers have access to protocols developed by experts that maybe are not there in the country where a study needs to be conducted. Sara, when it comes to the benefits, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to what has been said. Yeah, thank you, Carla. When it comes to ethics committees, the fact of having these generic or master protocols to be reviewed in non-emergency situations is directed at having more efficient committees for rigorous and quick reviews. We have seen the importance of this during COVID. If we have pre-approved protocols, the basic has already been addressed. And so in emergency, we only need to address the contextualization with our quicker or expeditious review, so that finally we have a rigorous and scientifically valid research in a short span of time. So from the perspective of these committees, these pre-approval processes do help because they will reduce the burden of work during emergencies. Thank you, Sara. All of us who have been in ethics committees during the COVID pandemic emergency, we have read many protocols, and we said, well, maybe we could have been addressed before. This document could have been allotted before. The part of idea of part of the idea of pre-approved protocols is to do together as much as possible for the work from the start, prior to an emergency, to start a research that is scientifically rigorous with adequate times before giving the floor to Patricia to see if she wants to complement anything from the point of view of benefits. I want to stress what we have been stressing repeatedly at PAHO, not only during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also you will remember that we did this since the Zika outbreak. What we're trying to think together as a region with all the pertinent actors is how to tailor processes to our needs. No one is talking about changing the ethical standards of research, but it is a matter of how to improve the process. The simple idea is to have ethical review, not with a single step, but with two steps, a larger and a smaller step. It's a matter of processes. And now I give the floor to Patricia. Will you continue using clinical good practices as a standard to authorize the clinical test? Yes, we need to think together on the process. Patricia, an idea of this.
The first reflection I want to share with you is that one thing we need to work on more in our region is communication amongst the various stakeholders. That is to say, the researchers are in one place and they think that the ethics committee and the regulatory authorities take too long. The ethics committees think that the regulatory authority takes too long and it goes around and round, and we do not have enough communication amongst these stakeholders. For a health technology to be available during a pandemic, and somebody put in a medical device as well, for this to be able to quickly meet the needs of the population, and we should not lose sight of the fact that that is our real purpose, to serve the community at large. There needs to be fluid relationships between the stakeholders. And you need, during a pandemic, you need to work in greater coordination than ever. So you need to have preparation or vaccine production that is not going to be used by the sponsor because they may or may not approve it. At the same time as the data comes out, the ethics committee and the regulatory authorities are going to be looking at all this, and so on and so on. This is precisely why we have adaptive studies that can, as data comes out, everyone analyzes it, and you don't wait until the end to have an evaluation. No, you use scientific criteria applied in real time. How much better could this be if we already had a skeleton of the protocol beforehand? Because we're thinking of everything once it started, but we never think about the preliminary work, that this also could be done to help us move forward. And as Laura Traversi said, if we could know beforehand what the potential challenges are and to logistics and implementation, I'm not just talking about regulatory authorities, I'm talking also about ethics committees, but also those who have to prepare things. But then it might come in and the regulatory authority says, I don't want that. No, then the ethics committee says you have to change the design. But it would be so much better if we had a regulatory instrument that allowed us to sit down and say, I opine on this design. What do you think about this? What do you think about the sample size? What do you think about other things? And then we could put in the things that come up Once you have to activate the protocol, you might find out this and that variable, but essentially you might have a consensus on what you might expect as a regulatory authority or as an ethics committee or a sponsor to implement it. And the researchers also have a lot to say because they prepare their centers for this. They don't just start from nothing. They will be preparing their centers in response to the logic of the protocol. So that is the practical purpose of a pre-approved protocol. So that's what I think we need to think of. That is a tremendous benefit because thus far, once the protocol was approved, then you go to the adaptive model. I study the results and everything all at the same time, and production and everything, best manufacturing practices, etc. But they never thought about all of the preliminary time that might be wasted. But there are many questions, and I'll be very honest, and sometimes there are many questions saying, but when would it start? I have to tell everyone in the region, we have to figure this out together. There isn't anything already done. We have to think together about what situations, when, how, with what legal instruments, with what regulatory instruments, with what instruments and procedures for ethics committee. In other words, we have to think this through. They're great questions, but you have to not just ask questions, but begin to lay out paths and possibilities. Carla speaking. Thank you very much, Patricia. I'd just like to highlight a very important issue in terms of reviewing what we did during the pandemic. And I remind you that we have this recommendations publication. We should have much better coordination amongst all of the parties. And that is a lesson that not only applies to emergencies, but if we were better coordinated amongst those who conduct the research, those who give the ethics approval, and the regulatory authority, why save that better coordination just for emergencies? If we can work better, more efficiently, and making sure that the highest standards are met, why should we only do that during an emergency? I fully agree with what you're saying, that we need to think of how to do this. And I wish to remind you something. If you go to Guideline 20, CIOMS, which is a situation of disease outbreaks and disaster. What did we have before COVID? And if you compare that to what we produced during COVID with the prior publication of March 2020, which was then taken up here again, you see that before COVID, the message was, we have to do this, you have to do that. No one was saying how to do it. And why is that? Because we hadn't figured it out yet. And if you look here, up until then, the guidance to the region returns of how to do a rapid ethics review, not only at the level of the committee, but also to have a national strategy to avoid redundancies. This is the most detailed thing we have on a global scale. Now we have to do the exact same thing. I wish to thank Lucas Lacerna for his comment, supporting Leonardo Corrales, because I do think that in fact, what we have to do as PAHO is put out guidance and add in this topic, which it's already on our pending regional agenda. So we should add this issue to our technical cooperation work. Many of you may not be aware, but the support that we as PAHO give to the countries, and Sarah and Patricia are aware of this, in many cases, it's a matter of reviewing or helping them develop standards. This implies that we have to understand what certain standards mean and how we have to proceed to make sure that the research is done according to the highest possible ethics and regulatory standards. And as Patricia says, we have to look at the benefits that the research seeks for our populations. So I think that that has to be PAHO's commitment moving forward, and we're very pleased to have the collaboration and cooperation of CEPI for this work, so we can give more detailed guidance for these processes and for how we can work in coordination and collaboration to expedite the start of research. I have a question for Nina, which goes back to at least two questions that different people have asked. And this shows me that there are some issues that I had never thought of. For example, since PAHO and the WHO prepare generic protocols, I think we have to decide on a set term for this, but we know what we're talking about. Skeletons of protocols for various topics. I gave you the example of chronic kidney disease. They're not clinical studies, but these are studies, but generic studies. And what I do in Nicaragua will be adapted to Nicaragua. If I want to do it in Honduras, it will be adapted to the context of Honduras. But we prepare these protocols, and of course, since I work at PAHO, I'm really aware of this. I know that the PAHO Ethics Committee will pre-approve it. But one of your questions showed me that many people do not know what exists in these master protocols, pre-approved or not. So my question to Nina is, how would you proceed in terms of a registry of pre-approved clinical trials? Is there a practice of including in clinicaltrials.gov or in any other registry that feeds into this these protocols once they're pre-approved or not? If it's not done, then what do you think we should do to have a registry and to publicize this, even though it would just be the basic pre-approved protocols? Thank you, Nina.
Thank you, Carla. I think you're addressing a very important question, and I think I don't have the answer to your question. I think there is no repository at the moment where pre-approved protocols are being stored. You mentioned PAHO and WHO. Of course, you have your master protocols, and they are accessible. And I think similarly, what we are doing at CEPI, the pre-approved protocols that we are developing, we would make them accessible, of course, publicly accessible on a yet to defined site. So I think we are very open to work with the PAHO region and also WHO to identify how to best and where to best store these protocols. I think they need to be publicly accessible. I think we all agree on that it should be open access to everyone and not just to specific researchers or agencies. So I think that I don't have much more to say to that. I think it's still an open question, and I think there's a lot of work to do to actually establish such a registry and try to identify what's the best place for a repository and where to store it.
Thank you, Nina. I'm going to switch to English just for a little bit of a change. I don't know if you are aware of the MURI protocols. That's it's a non-research type of protocol for what the FDA called expanded access. So that those are protocols for use of a non-proven intervention in a very extraordinary manner in an emergency. So, and you may remember during COVID, those protocols, that modality was used, for example, for convalescent plasma and in other cases. So one thing that we suggested during COVID, and it's also here, and we noticed clinicaltrials.gov was the first one to act upon that suggestion, was to include under clinicaltrials.gov a specific tab to register those protocols too. And I think that we have to think about something like that that kind of serves also as like a one stop for accessing all pre-approved protocols. And I think for different reasons, some because investigators may be interested, but even to learn how to develop a pre-approved protocol, I think you learn by reading one. And I think from a capacity building perspective, they are very important too. So I'm gonna ask a question to Sarah and Patricia. And again, it's a question that we're about something we're trying to figure out together. And it's about what would be, say you pre-approved the protocol. What should be the time frames of the pre-approval, and how should we handle this? It's not obvious to me. I don't know if you have any thoughts or ideas to share. And whomever wants to start, please take the mic.
Creo que puedo empezar.
I think that I could start.
A ver, plazos concretos.
Let's see,
No
specific
sabría especificar.
time
Lo que sí
frames.
creo
I don't know how to
es que el
specify
proceso de
that. What I do know is that during the
cuando no
pre-approval
estamos
process, that is to
en
say,
la
when we're
emergencia,
not in the midst of
debería
an
no
emergency
tomar
yet,
mucho más de lo que se demora una
it shouldn't take much
revisión
more than
ética,
what
digamos, en tiempos habituales. Lo que sí
a
creo que es
usual
imperativo es que
ethics
cuando ya
review. What's
regrese el
a little bit
protocolo
different is that when
contextualizado
the
para esta
contextualized
revisión
protocol comes back
ética
for
final,
final
sí la
ethics
revisión tiene
approval,
que ser
that
tan
review
necesario
needs
de
to
todo el
be
comité de ética a
expedited.
revisar algo, porque
The entire
recordemos que
ethics
ya
committee
aprobaron
doesn't
el
not
esqueleto.
necessarily have to
Solamente
approve it
faltan
because
estas
they already approved the
especificaciones.
skeleton. We just need to put in
Podría
the
hacerse por la Secretaría
specifications,
Técnica,
and
por
it
par
might
de
be done through the
miembros, o sea,
technical
hay
secretariat or
fórmulas,
two
va a
members. I
depender
don't know.
de,
There are different
digamos, la
formulas,
organización
and this
del
will
comité
be
en
up to the
concreto.
organization specific
Pero creo que
committee
eso
is part of.
me atrevería a decir. La
But I
idea de
would
que
be so bold as
podamos
to
asegurar
say that the
procesos
idea of
rápidos y rigurosos bajo
ensuring
los mismos
rapid,
estándares
rigorous
éticos
procedures under the
internacionales da
same
razón para
international
pensar que esos
ethical
protocolos
procedures,
se
we
van
should not think
a
that these
guiar por otras
protocols
pautas, ¿no?
are going to
Solo
be
excepción,
guided
sino que se
by
va a aplicar.
any other
Sí creo que
standards. And I do
Sergio mencionaba,
believe
por ejemplo,
that, like Sergio
la falta de
mentioned this,
capacidad de algunos
the
comités
lack
puede
of
complicar estas
capacity in
revisiones
some
de
committees
protocolos
might
preaprobados,
be a hindrance
pero
to
bueno,
the
entonces es
pre-approved
hora de empezar a
protocols.
fortalecer nuestras
But
capacidades
we will
como
begin
miembros del
to
comité
strengthen
de
our
ética,
capacities as
hacer
members of
entrenamientos
Ethics
en protocolos
Committee,
preaprobados, protocolos
do
genéricos.
training on
La
generic and
práctica
pre-approved
ayuda
protocols,
muchísimo
and also
a poder,
practice
digamos, a identificar
really helps
las cuestiones
us
éticas, los
get
que
better at
debemos
identifying the ethics issues.
resolver,
And
las observaciones que
we
debemos brindar a
have
los
various
investigadores, la colaboración con otros
observations for
autores es
investigators.
importantísima,
Collaboration with other
Patricia
authors is
estaba
also very
mencionando. Y
important,
también
as
recordemos
Patricia
que
was
como miembros de
mentioning.
comités de ética
And
podemos
also
llamar
as members of
expertos.
ethics
Entonces,
committees, we
los
need to remember
expertos
that we can
pueden,
bring in experts.
digamos,
And the
darnos
experts
toda esa
might
pericia o
give
conocimiento
us
que no
all of that
tenemos si es
expertise
que
and knowledge that we
no
don't
estamos muy cómodos
necessarily
en
have
poder
ourselves,
revisar
that
un
might make us
protocolo
feel a
para
little bit
preaprobación.
uncomfortable in
Entonces, para resumir,
approving
creo que la
a
preaprobación
preliminary
debería extenderse.
protocol.
No hay razón
So
para que se extienda más que
I
una aprobación
don't
ética
think that it should take
habitual.
the
Pero sí creo
pre-approval shouldn't take
que la
longer than a
aprobación final, la
usual
definitiva,
ethics
por
approval, but for
cualquier
the
situación de
final
emergencia,
approval, like
debería ser
on
mucho más rápida. Ya saben que hemos
everything under an
conversado
emergency needs
todos
to
con
be
el
much
comité y
quicker,
saben que tienen
and the
también
committee is
aprobación.
already
Entonces,
familiar
ya no podemos
and knows it
necesitar
has a
volver a
pre-approval,
revisar lo mismo.
so we
Plazos
don't have to
cortos,
review what we've
revisiones
already
cortas,
looked
algunos
at,
tiempos,
short
algunas cuestiones que
time
son
frames, and that's what I can think of.
Yo por ahí
Patricia.
aportar desde lo
I would
regulatorio.
just say from the regulatory side that normally, I'm not talking about under a pandemic, but in normal times, when a producer or the owner of a potential
hace el plan de
license
de
or
desarrollo de tal
registration,
registro,
plans to
ha
develop
terminado
that
los
product,
estudios no
and they have
clínicos
finished the
se
non-clinical
reúnen
studies.
con, por ejemplo, la FDA o
They
la EMA,
meet with the EMA or the
y
FDA,
ahí discuten sobre el plan de
and
desarrollo,
they
que es lo que
discuss
ese
the
titular tiene
development plan. That's what the
pensado
principal
en
investigator
términos de qué
has been
diseños de
thinking of in
protocolo,
terms of protocol
qué tamaño de la
designs,
muestra,
sample
cuántos estudios,
size,
en
how
qué
many studies to
poblaciones,
conduct,
etcétera.
and what populations, and so forth.
Esto es normal, esto es lo que se hace
And that
para
is
todos los
normal. That is
productos.
what is done for all products.
Bueno, lo que hace ANMAT
What
es
UNMAT
algo
does
similar,
is
no solo
similar,
para pandemia, como bien
not
dijo
only
Laura
for
Traversi,
pandemics,
sino
as
en las
Laura
otras
Traversi
figuras.
said. There are
Lo que
other
necesitamos es pensar la figura. Podemos tener
figures.
esta
We have to
figura,
think of what figure, what
aunque sea para pandemia, de discusión previa,
how we have this
aspectos, y
prior
obviamente
discussion
después
of
por tanto
aspects
tienen que
that
ir
later on
actualizándose
might have to be
conforme van
updated,
apareciendo
because
nuevas
as
circunstancias en
new
la
circumstances
enfermedad que se va
arise in terms of a disease
estudiar,
that will
habrá
be
que ir
studied,
actualizando el protocolo,
then
pero
the
ya la
protocol will
base,
have to be
y la base
updated.
se puede
However, the
discutir
foundation
porque
is
no
already
sos
there, and you can
solamente los
discuss the
diseños.
foundation because the designs
No
aren't all
podemos
that
seguir pensando
different.
que hay un
We
diseño
can't
para
continue
cada
to think that
cosita,
there's a
no,
single design
los
for every
diseños
little thing.
son bastante
No,
similares,
the
y
study
el
designs are rather
tratamiento
similar
estadístico también.
and statistical management the
Hay
same.
una base que se
So
puede discutir previa.
there is
Ahora,
a
el carácter de
foundation
esa
that can be
discusión
discussed beforehand. Now, the
que
character of
tiene
that
ANMAT en
discussion
nuestra región,
of
la
that
FDA
ANMAT
o
might
la
have in our
EMA,
region, or the FDA or the EMA,
no se puede dar en las otras si no tienen el marco
cannot
normativo,
occur
porque sería
in
simplemente una
other
discusión
contexts
y
if
no
they
un
don't have a
consenso
pre-approved
sobre lo que las partes
uh,
quieren
format.
para
And
llegar a la determinación de calidad, eficacia y seguridad.
And
Está bien.
that would
Entonces,
help
es
for the discussion
necesario
about quality and
desarrollar
safety.
ese marco
So we
normativo.
need
Puede
to
ser
develop the
en
regulatory
diferentes
framework,
formas como
which
estuvimos
might
viendo,
take
pero tiene
different
que haber
forms as we've been looking at, but there has to be a
Yo
regulatory
creo que en
framework.
ese marco
So
no
I
hay
think that within
plazos,
that framework, you
así
don't
como la
you don't
FDA y
really
la
have
EMA
deadlines, just
discuten
that the
5 años
FDA and
antes,
EMA might
no
discuss
5,
it
3,
5
4
years
años
ahead of time,
antes.
not 5 years, but 3 or 4 years.
Me refiero a los productos cuando
I'm
hacen el
referring
meeting,
to
lo discuten
products when
muchos
you
años
have a
antes,
meeting, they discuss
que
it
se
many
hace el
years
protocolo.
prior,
Bueno, es lo
and you
mismo, si
prepare the
estamos
protocol. Well,
se
it's
está
not the same thing.
discutiendo
If we are
sobre la
discussing
base del esqueleto,
on the basis of a
a
skeleton,
ver, que va a llevar a esos de los
what
requerimientos, como bien dijo
this might
Laura, de
read
las
to the
cosas
requirements
que
that
está
Laura is
esperando
saying,
la agencia
and what the
regulatoria, de
regulatory
cómo
agency is
su
waiting
desarrollo
for,
es
and you
patrocinador,
should, the
son
development was already planned out
todas
by the
cuestiones que se
developer,
pueden ir
and then all
adelantando y
of the
después ir
issues that could be
completando
handled
a medida
beforehand
que
until you
aparece la
complete
información
the
de ese
file, until you
protocolo,
get
que se va a actualizar muchas veces,
the information to
supondrá
put
muchas
into this
reuniones
protocol. So
previas
there
a la
may be
aprobación.
many meetings prior to approval.
Gracias a
Carla.
Patricia.
Thank you,
Creo que
Patricia.
un tema fundamental
One fundamental
en relación a la
issue
discusión de los plazos
related to the
es que en la
discussion
medida que
of
si
the
al
time
esqueleto
periods
le
is
falta la
that
carne y
if
la
the
carne
skeleton
tiene que
needs to be
volver para
fleshed
una
out
aprobación
more, and once
definitiva,
it has to be
la
fleshed out
preocupación de
before
que
it
algo sea
appears for
extemporáneo
final
es
approval,
menos seria porque tiene que
something
volver con carne para
extemporaneous
la
isn't
aprobación final
as
de todas
serious,
maneras,
because it has to
¿verdad?
come back all fleshed out
Yo estaba
for the
pensando en
final
algo que
approval. At
decía
any rate, I was just
Patricia
thinking
cuando
of something that
decía
Patricia has said.
que hay una gran
She was
cantidad de
saying
cuestiones que
that
se
there are
pueden
so
adelantar.
many issues
Yo
that you
pensaba,
could
por
move
ejemplo,
forward on. I was thinking, for example,
estoy pensando en estudios
and here I'm
que
thinking of
no,
studies
que no son de nuevos medicamentos y
that are
dispositivos,
not
es
for
decir,
new
que
medicines
no
or new
requieren
medical
la
devices. In other words,
supervisión
that
de
do
la
not
autoridad regulatoria
require the
nacional,
supervision of the
pero para
National
los que podemos
Regulatory
hacer
Authority.
protocolos
But for
preaprobados
those of
también,
us who might
como los muchos que
prepare
hemos
pre-approved
necesitado en
protocols,
las emergencias.
it's a lot of what
¿Por
you
qué?
might
Porque los
need during an
diseños son
emergency. Why do you say
similares.
this?
Un
Because the
estudio de
designs are
casos y
similar.
controles.
One case control
Tuvimos uno para
study,
Zika,
we
tenemos dos
had one for
para
Zika,
oropuche.
another one
Estudios
for
de cohortes,
Puche,
básicamente
and
las
cohort
estructuras, el
studies.
gran
Essentially,
corazón
the
del
structure of the
protocolo
heart
es el
of the
mismo.
protocol
Y
is the
tenemos
same.
con
And
Me gustó mucho
I really liked
el slide de Nina con
Nina's slide.
con los cambios de las llantas de Fórmula 1.
The Formula One race cars changing their tires. You see how we know that you can do it much quicker. You can move more quickly because the protocol for case control studies for Arapuche is very similar to the case control protocol for Zika. So from that angle, I think we can move forward. I have two questions for Nina. As regards the pre-approved protocols that CEPI has already done in other places, is there some place or a website that you could share in the chat with the participants so that we could see an example of a pre-approved protocol, some experience CEPI has had using pre-approved protocols in another region? So that's my first question or request. And the second one and last one is there any other important message you would like to share from your global perspective and your experience with other regions of the world and regulatory authorities in other parts of the world? Is there something that you could share with us that you think would be useful to the region of the Americas?
Yes, so first of all, unfortunately, I'm not able yet to share anything because we have not concluded on the protocol. So we have started, as I mentioned earlier, a protocol for a potential Nipah X outbreak. And I specifically say X because with the current epidemiology of Nipah, there's no way you can do any clinical trial that provides you a significant readout. So we were working with modelers to actually play with parameters and assume a change in strain that actually would make the virus more transmissible. And based on that modeling, we were actually discussing a clinical trial design for efficacy readouts. And I think what is important, and I link that now the first to the second question that you have. So we had been discussing with several stakeholders, and I think I mentioned that as well, that it's important to have like regional entities involved, that you have key opinion leaders involved, the investigators involved, developers and the communities. And then finally, of course, regulatory and ethical bodies. But I think what is important is that it takes several iterations to come to the optimal trial design. And yes, you say one trial design is similar to the other, but just changing a little bit from a cluster randomized trial within an individual cluster randomized trial, that changes the statistics quite significantly. So it's a very tiny tweak, but has huge implications. So I think we were discussing quite significantly what can be done within all the stakeholders. And I think what is essential that with this good dialogue, actually, and the prior established relationships that we have up front, you build trust. And I think in terms of a pandemic, you need then to build on the trust that you have actually established up front. So I think that's what I would like to convey.
Muchísimas gracias, Nina, porque ese es un mensaje.
Thank you very much, Nina, because that is a central message. I remember when we worked on this guidance, we decided that aspects related to trust in research needed to be central. I remember that we moved it up to chapter 2. We put trust in research right up front there. And to that end, we knew that you have to communicate transparently what research is being done and how is it done. That is central. But I also think we need to try to make this effort in prospective fashion. We need to move forward preparing for an emergency and try to team up with society and also look at the themes that we've established with other stakeholders. Some of you may not be aware, but PAHO has a forum that brings together all of the regulators, particularly those who authorize clinical trials. This is led by Patricia, and within the regional bioethics program, we have FRENSE, which is a forum for all of the national authorities that supervises the ethics committee. And this is where the guidance comes in terms of how to do our ethics work. So those are the legs of the table, and we have to add civil society to this. Our time is almost out, and many of you have asked to receive the recording of this meeting. We invite you to sign up for our mailing list because we're going to share the recording of this session there. We're also going to post it on the clinical trials portal of PAHO and on the regional bioethics website. And I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to make a public commitment for PAHO to continue to develop guidance for pre-approved protocols. This is something that we are going to work on in collaboration with CEPI, and I think that this is an excellent opportunity for our region to build on the work that we already did during the pandemic and to continue to move research forward that can resolve the health problems of our populations as quickly as they need it. Thank you, all of you, for accompanying us today, and I wish you an excellent afternoon. Thank you, colleagues.
Gracias, buenos días.
Thank you.
Gracias, hasta luego.
Gracias. Adiós.
Muchas gracias.